Good morning and welcome to Assembly. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you today. And this month in January, our assemblies are looking at the gifts of the wise men. Epiphany, the day that we remember that the wise men came and visited the infant Jesus, was just a couple of weeks ago. And so throughout January, we're going to be looking at those gifts that they brought and what they can tell us today, what they mean, what they symbolise. And I'm going to talk about gold, the gift of gold. And of course, that symbolises royalty, which suggests several things to us, I think, today. It suggests great privilege, great power, great status, great wealth, although in this case, with the gifts of the Magi, that can mean many things other than riches of monetary value, can't it? But we always think of those things when we think of royalty. But royalty has always carried with us that other side of privilege, duty and responsibility and care. And certainly I think if you consider what the Magi were saying when they brought their gifts, what we're meant to see in the symbolic nature of those things, then all of those things and more are carried in that gift of gold, aren't they? Our modern sense of royalty, I think, dates back always, if we trace back the line of kings and queens in this country, we tend to go back as far as 1066 and William I, or William the Conqueror, as he's often called, who arrived as king in this country from Normandy in France. And as an English teacher, a lot of what interests me of that period is the number of words and phrases that have come down to us in our modern English language, in our lexicon, our vocabulary from that period, from the Norman French. But that's for another assembly, if at all, that I get to talk about those things. The phrase that I'm thinking of at the moment comes from that time, and it's the phrase noblesse oblige, which says exactly that if you have the good fortune to have that wealth and that privilege and that status, then you're obliged to do good with it. You are obliged to be active, not just to think of others, but to do good for others. That duty and that responsibility, that aspect of royalty comes with always the idea of duty and responsibility and doing the right thing. And in English literature, which of course I'm also interested in, writers explore what it is to be human, what it is to be alive, those big themes that concern us all. And Shakespeare, for me, is the writer at the foremost of doing that well. And he, in many of his plays, quite a number of his plays, he looks at this notion of royalty. He would call it kingship. And probably in 2021, we should broaden it out and think of it as leadership. Shakespeare very much considers that aspect of the royal, and his belief as he presents kingship to us, that the good king is one who is responsible, who is wise, who is kind, who does good, and first and foremost considers the people he rules over and above his consideration of himself. And so Shakespeare, if you've done GCSE or you're doing GCSE now, you'll know that Shakespeare gives us Macbeth, a king who certainly doesn't embody those qualities and therefore comes to a tragic end. He gives us King Lear, a king who gives away his kingdom, which you must never do. For Shakespeare, that responsibility that comes with royalty is a commitment, and it's not something that you can pass on to somebody else. So King Lear gives away his kingdom, but he wants to give away the work, he wants to give away the duty, but he wants to keep the privilege. And of course, again, comes to a tragic end. That can't happen in Shakespeare's world. And Shakespeare also gives us Prince Hal, the prince who in Henry IV seemingly just wants to live for pleasure, does not want to consider what it would mean to be king, doesn't want any of the work, it appears, in King Henry IV. But then Hal, in King Henry V, becomes the king who knows and understands the job he has to do. And often, as in Shakespeare, that job, again, is hard for us sometimes from a modern perspective to understand, but he knows that his duty is to the men that follow him. And Henry V is a king who leads from the front and inspires, and does not come to the tragic end of the previous two kings that I've spoken about. He understands he has to lead by example, and he's the king who says, "In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, and summon up the blood." You must act when you're called upon to act. You must look at the circumstance and you must do your duty. And King Henry V becomes the heroic king because, in other words, he doesn't shirk his duties. Because in Shakespeare, bad kings come to bad ends. Because right and privilege and status and wealth carry with them duty and obligation and responsibility. And I don't think those ideas have changed since Shakespeare. I think they're probably not bad ideas for us to remember as we go through our lives in 2021.